I thought moving into the old house on Elm Street was a fresh start for my family. It was a charming Victorian, the kind that seemed to promise stories and history just waiting to be uncovered. But from the moment we stepped inside, something felt off. It was more than just the dust-covered furniture or the echoing silence. It was a sense of dread that clung to the corners of every room. My wife, Sarah, tried to be optimistic. "It's just an old house," she said, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Our two kids, Emily and Jake, seemed equally unsettled, though they were too excited about their new rooms to voice their concerns. That night, after we'd settled in, the house seemed to come alive. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and the old pipes groaned like something was trapped inside them. We tried to ignore it, attributing it to the age of the house and the fact that we were in a new place. But as the night wore on, things began to get strange. The clock in the hallway struck midnight, and the air grew colder. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the attic. It was almost as if someone, or something, was moving around up there. I climbed out of bed, heart racing, and headed for the attic door. The staircase creaked under my weight, each step echoing through the dark. When I reached the top, I hesitated, my hand resting on the doorknob. I pushed it open only to find nothing. Just old, dusty boxes and a few forgotten relics of past occupants. Relieved, I headed back downstairs, but something caught my eye in the hallway mirror. It was a fleeting glimpse, but I swear I saw a shadow dart across the room behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The next morning, Sarah and I chalked it up to the stress of moving. Emily and Jake, however, had their own stories. Emily claimed she'd heard whispering in her room, and Jake insisted the toy train in his room had moved on its own. I tried to reassure them, but as the days went by, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors began to open and close on their own. Cold spots appeared randomly, and we all started having the same unsettling dreams about being trapped in the house. But the worst was yet to come. That first night, as I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, the clock struck midnight again. I heard the thumping in the attic, but this time it was accompanied by a voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I got up to investigate, my nerves on edge. The attic was still empty, but when I returned to my room, I found the door ajar, even though I was sure I had closed it. I shut it tightly and tried to ignore the creeping sense of being watched. We were about to discover that the house on Elm Street held a sinister secret, one that would trap us in a never-ending cycle of fear and despair. The days blended together, each one more unsettling than the last. We'd barely settled into our new home when the first horrifying night struck. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with my heart pounding in my chest. The house was eerily silent, except for that damned thumping noise coming from the attic. I tried to ignore it, but the noise grew louder and more frantic, almost like a heartbeat. I glanced at the clock. It was exactly midnight. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that this was the same time the disturbances had begun before. I got out of bed and went to check on the kids, finding them both asleep, their faces peaceful despite the chaos outside their dreams. As I walked back to my room, the air grew colder, and I felt an oppressive presence surrounding me. I reached the attic door, my hand shaking as I turned the handle. The door creaked open to reveal the same dusty, cluttered space. I stepped inside, the thumping now almost deafening. Then, as if on cue, the noise abruptly stopped. The silence was thick and heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a dark, shadowy figure standing in the corner of the attic. I blinked, and it vanished. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled back downstairs, my mind racing with dread. In the morning, Sarah and the kids were already up. They looked at me with concern as I recounted my experiences. Sarah tried to be supportive, but her worry was evident. "Maybe it's just the house settling," she suggested. But the kids were already showing signs of distress. Emily was pale and quiet, and Jake clung to his mother, refusing to let go. We decided to stay home and try to get some rest, but the house seemed to have other plans. That night, as we all tried to sleep, a series of loud crashes echoed through the house. The sound of furniture being overturned and objects breaking filled the air. I leaped out of bed, rushing to the kids' room, only to find them awake and terrified. Before I could comfort them, the thumping in the attic resumed, louder and more frantic than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went back up to the attic, determined to confront whatever was making the noise. As I reached the top of the stairs, the air was icy cold, and a strange, overpowering odor filled my nostrils. something rotting, decaying. I shone the flashlight around, but the attic was empty. The thumping had stopped again, and the silence was even more unsettling. I turned to leave, but then I heard it, a soft, mournful cry coming from behind me. I swung around, the beam of the flashlight catching a glimpse of a figure in the shadows. It was a woman, her face twisted in agony, reaching out towards me. I gasped and stumbled backward, almost falling down the stairs. I fled back to our bedroom, my heart pounding. Sarah and the kids were waiting for me, their faces filled with concern and fear. We all huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. It was clear now that something was terribly wrong with this house. As the night dragged on, I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion finally claimed me. I woke up the next morning to find that things had only gotten worse. Our belongings had been moved around, and there were strange marks on the walls, scratches, almost like someone had tried to claw their way out. The house was becoming a nightmare, and I knew that we had to find out what was happening before it drove us all insane. Little did we know, the true horror was just beginning, and the house on Elm Street was about to reveal its darkest secret. The days continued to blur together as the unease in the house grew. Every night was a new variation of the same terror, but the cycle remained eerily consistent. We started noticing small, unsettling changes each day. Furniture rearranged, pictures crooked on the walls, and the same strange marks appearing in different places. That night, things took a more sinister turn. We were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. Sarah was on edge, and the kids were becoming more withdrawn. They refused to sleep in their rooms, instead huddling together in our bed. The house seemed to be pressing in on us from all sides, its presence almost tangible. Just before midnight, the house fell into an oppressive silence. The thumping in the attic had become a nightly occurrence, but tonight it was different, more rhythmic, like a heartbeat synchronizing with our own. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard a soft whisper coming from the hallway. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was as if someone or something was trying to communicate. I got up to investigate, creeping down the darkened hallway. As I approached the attic door, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar, and the cold draft seemed to be coming from within. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The attic was empty, but the temperature had dropped significantly. I felt a shiver run through me as I scanned the room with my flashlight. The beam caught a glimpse of something strange. An old, dusty mirror propped against the wall. It hadn't been there before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the mirror. As I looked into it, I saw something move behind me, an indistinct shape that seemed to shift and waver. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The mirror seemed to draw me in, its surface cloudy and distorted. I reached out to touch it, but before I could, the thumping in the attic grew louder, more frantic. The sound seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards, echoing through the house. I ran back downstairs, my heart racing. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. I tried to wake Sarah, but she was in a deep sleep, her face expressionless and eerily calm. Suddenly, the house shook violently, as if an earthquake had struck. I grabbed the kids and pulled them out of bed, heading for the front door. The hallway was in disarray, with objects thrown about as if caught in a whirlwind. The house seemed to be alive, its walls pulsating with a malevolent energy. As we reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. I could hear the cries of the children, their fear mirroring my own. We retreated back into the living room, trying to find some semblance of safety. The thumping grew louder, now accompanied by a cacophony of voices, screams, whispers, and moans, all blending together into a nightmarish symphony. I knew we couldn't stay here. We had to find a way out, but every attempt to escape was thwarted by the house's shifting, changing nature. It was as if we were caught in a never-ending loop of terror, each night more terrifying than the last. In the early hours of the morning, the noise abruptly stopped. The house fell silent once more. We were left in a state of terrified exhaustion, unsure of what to expect next. It was then that I noticed the clock on the wall. It had reset itself to midnight. The realization hit me like a cold wave. We were trapped in a time loop, doomed to relive the same horrifying events over and over again. And each time, it seemed, the house grew more malevolent, more desperate to break us. We had to find a way to break free from this nightmarish cycle, but with each passing night, the house's grip tightened. I could only hope that we would survive long enough to find the answer before it consumed us entirely. Every night felt like a replay of the same dread. We were trapped in a relentless cycle, each iteration of the night growing more horrifying. The house seemed to take pleasure in our fear, the eerie atmosphere tightening around us like a noose. That night, I was determined to get to the bottom of the house's malevolent force. Sarah and the kids had fallen into an exhausted sleep, but I couldn't rest. I knew there had to be something that could break the loop, something hidden within the house's dark history. I made my way to the attic once more, the thumping sound eerily absent for the first time. The mirror still stood there, its surface reflecting a warped version of reality. This time I noticed something different. Written in the dust on the mirror was a series of symbols as if someone had scrawled them in desperation. I could barely make out their meaning, but one symbol caught my eye. A spiral, almost like a vortex. I felt drawn to it, as if it held the key to our escape. I examined the mirror more closely, running my fingers over the symbols. The mirror itself seemed to react, growing colder and emitting a faint, mournful hum. As I studied the mirror, a sudden noise from downstairs made me freeze. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I crept back down the attic stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, but I couldn't see anyone. Then, without warning, the house seemed to come alive again. The walls began to tremble, and the lights flickered wildly. The once familiar rooms twisted and warped before my eyes. I realized that the house was trying to disorient us, to make us lose hope. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back to the attic, determined to confront whatever force was at play. As I reached the top, the air was icy cold, and a low chant filled the attic. The source of the chanting was unclear, but it seemed to echo from the very walls themselves. I shone the flashlight around, trying to locate the source of the sound. My beam landed on an old book lying on the floor, half buried under dust and cobwebs. It looked ancient, its cover adorned with more of the strange symbols I had seen earlier. I opened the book, its pages yellowed and brittle. The text was written in a language I didn't understand, but there were illustrations depicting the same symbols and rituals that matched those on the mirror. One page showed a dark figure performing a ritual in front of a mirror, surrounded by the same spiral symbol. The realization struck me. The house had been involved in some dark occult practice, a ritual to trap souls in a time loop, ensuring their endless torment. This explained the repeating nightmares, the increasing terror each night. I flipped through the pages, desperate to find any clue on how to break the cycle. The final page depicted a ritual to reverse the process, an incantation to be performed during the witching hour when the house was at its most powerful. I knew what I had to do. I had to perform the ritual, but time was running out. The house seemed to be growing more aggressive, its malevolent energy intensifying. The walls creaked and groaned as if they were alive, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. With a deep breath, I gathered the necessary items from the attic: candles, a bowl of salt, and the book. I set up a makeshift altar in the living room, hoping that the open space would be safe enough. I lit the candles and began the incantation, trying to focus on the words despite the growing chaos around me. As I spoke the final words, the house shook violently. The lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The air grew heavy, and I could feel a dark presence closing in. I finished the ritual and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise. The house was still, its oppressive presence momentarily lifted. I waited, breath held, hoping against hope that the ritual had worked. But as the clock struck midnight, I realized that the cycle was about to start again. The thumping in the attic began anew, and the whispers returned, more urgent than before. The house had not been defeated, and we were still trapped in its nightmarish loop. I had to find another way out, or we would be doomed to relive this horror forever. The clock was ticking and the house was watching, waiting for us to make our next move. We had hoped the ritual might be our salvation, but the house was relentless. As the cycle began again, the oppressive atmosphere grew thicker, the sense of impending doom more palpable. I could feel the weight of our predicament pressing down on us. The next night, I decided to investigate the house further, hoping to find something, anything, that could help us escape this nightmare. Sarah and the kids were visibly shaken, their fear manifesting in restless sleep and anxious behavior. I couldn't let them see how close I was to breaking down myself. I started with the basement, a part of the house we had mostly ignored. The basement door creaked open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase that led into darkness. The air was damp and musty, and a faint, unpleasant odor lingered. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, broken appliances, and boxes of forgotten belongings. As I searched through the mess, I came across an old wooden chest, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. The lock was rusty but seemed to give way easily. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs and documents, all related to the house's past occupants. One photograph stood out, a group of people gathered around what looked like a ritualistic altar, their faces obscured. The symbols on the altar matched those from the mirror and the book. The realization hit me. This house had been the site of dark rituals long before we arrived, and its cursed history was deeply intertwined with its current malevolence. Among the documents was a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I flipped through it, searching for any clues. The entries were written in a frantic scrawl, detailing the gradual descent into madness of the previous occupants. They spoke of a relentless, malevolent force that seemed to feed on their fear, trapping them in a never-ending cycle of terror. One entry described an attempt to escape the loop. We tried to leave, but the house changes, shifts its rooms. We are trapped. The only way out is to confront the source, but it watches, waits, and tortures. There is no escape. The chilling words mirrored our own experiences. We were dealing with a house that was actively fighting to keep us imprisoned. I had to find a way to break its hold before it drove us to the brink of insanity. That night, as the clock struck midnight, the thumping in the attic grew louder and more erratic. The house seemed to be mocking our attempts to break free. The lights flickered and the walls seemed to close in, making us feel as if we were being suffocated by the house's dark will. Sarah was frantic, her nerves frayed by the constant terror. She clung to me, her eyes wide with fear. The kids were huddled together, their faces pale and their eyes filled with a mixture of terror and exhaustion. I knew I had to do something, and I had to do it fast. I gathered the family in the living room and tried to reassure them, though my own fear was barely contained. We needed to stay together, to keep our minds sharp. The house was designed to break us apart, to isolate us and make us vulnerable. Just then, the basement door burst open with a deafening crash. I turned to see what had caused the noise, only to find the basement stairs now completely blocked by debris. Furniture and old boxes had somehow been thrown against the door. We were trapped on the first floor, cut off from the basement and any potential answers it might have held. The house was tightening its grip, and I could feel its malevolence growing stronger. It was clear now that we had to confront whatever force was behind this, but the house itself seemed to be actively working against us. Each night brought new horrors, new challenges, and each night seemed to bring us closer to the brink of our sanity. With the basement inaccessible and our options growing limited, we had to find another way to confront the house's dark force. The cycle continued, each repetition of the night becoming more nightmarish than the last. The house was not just a prison, it was a living, breathing entity that was determined to keep us trapped within its walls. We were now fully immersed in the nightmare that had become our daily existence. The house seemed to grow more hostile with each passing night, its malevolent will manifesting in increasingly horrific ways. The lights flickered more violently, and the walls seemed to breathe with a life of their own. On the sixth night, the terror reached new heights. As usual, we gathered in the living room, trying to find comfort in each other's presence. The thumping in the attic had become a constant, pulsating rhythm, an unsettling reminder of the house's unrelenting grip. That night, as the clock approached midnight, the house shook violently. The lights went out, plunging us into darkness, and a guttural, inhuman growl echoed through the walls. The sound was so overwhelming that it felt like the house itself was trying to tear itself apart. In the pitch black, I heard Emily scream. I rushed to her side, finding her clutching her head in terror. She was babbling incoherently, her eyes wide with an unimaginable fear. I tried to calm her down, but it was as if something unseen was tormenting her. Suddenly, a cold, icy wind swept through the room, and the temperature dropped drastically. The air felt thick and oppressive, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and the house seemed to be closing in on us. Then, without warning, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It was a dark silhouette, its features indistinguishable, but its presence was unmistakably malevolent. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if it was savoring our fear. The figure seemed to reach out towards Emily, its shadowy hand stretching toward her. I tried to intervene, but as I moved towards her, the figure vanished, and the house returned to its eerie silence. Emily collapsed, her body limp, her eyes staring blankly. Sarah and I were in a state of panic. We checked on Emily, but she was unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. I knew we had to do something, but what could we do against an entity that seemed to defy all logic? I remembered the journal I had found in the basement. It mentioned a ritual involving a sacrifice, a way to appease the malevolent force and break the loop. The thought filled me with dread, but desperation drove me to consider it. I had to make a choice. Risk everything in an attempt to save my family or continue living in this nightmarish cycle. As I held Emily, The house began to shift again. The walls trembled, and the room seemed to contort and stretch, as if the house was trying to disorient us. I could hear whispers growing louder, their urgency palpable. I had to act quickly. I grabbed the journal and tried to decipher the ritual. The instructions were cryptic, but it seemed to involve an offering, a symbolic sacrifice to appease the malevolent force and restore balance. With a heavy heart, I realized what needed to be done. The house seemed to be guiding me towards the living room, where an old, dusty ceremonial dagger lay hidden in the attic's belongings. I retrieved it, feeling its cold, heavy weight in my hand. The clock struck midnight, and the house fell into chaos. The thumping in the attic became deafening, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, each one filled with a pleading, desperate tone. With trembling hands, I prepared the ritual. I drew the symbols from the journal on the floor, the dagger glinting in the dim light of the candles I had managed to light. I knew that this ritual would not come without a cost, but I had no choice. I placed the dagger on the ceremonial altar and began the incantation, trying to remain focused despite the growing terror around me. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, and I could feel the presence of the malevolent force pressing in from all sides. As I completed the ritual, the house seemed to convulse, its walls trembling violently. The whispers turned into screams, and the growling became a roar that filled the entire house. It was as if the house was protesting, fighting against the ritual with all its might. Suddenly, everything stopped. The house fell into a profound silence, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift. I looked around, hoping against hope that the ritual had worked. But the silence was short-lived. The house seemed to be preparing for something more sinister, a final, devastating twist in its relentless torment. I could feel the malevolent presence gathering strength, and I knew that our nightmare was far from over. The house had not been defeated. It was only biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Emily remained unconscious, her fate uncertain. The house had claimed its first victim, and I could only hope that the ritual had not been in vain. The battle was far from over, and the true horror of the house on Elm Street was yet to reveal itself. The house seemed to simmer in the aftermath of the ritual, its oppressive silence broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. I stayed by Emily's side, her condition unchanged. She remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and her face pale. Sarah and the kids were huddled together, their fear palpable. The house felt different, as though it was waiting for something that would break the tenuous calm that had settled over us. I could sense the malevolent presence lurking just beneath the surface, its dark influence still very much alive. Desperation drove me to continue searching for answers. The journal had provided some insight, but it was far from comprehensive. I needed to understand more about the house's history, the rituals that had been performed, and the true nature of the force that haunted us. That night, as I paced the living room, I heard a faint rhythmic tapping coming from the walls. It was a pattern, almost like a code, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the attic. The sound was unsettling, as if the house was trying to communicate, or worse, mock our efforts to escape. I decided to investigate. As I climbed the attic stairs, the tapping grew louder, more urgent. The air was cold, and a sense of foreboding hung in the atmosphere. I reached the top and scanned the room. The mirror was still there, but something was different. It seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. I approached the mirror, its surface shimmering unnaturally. As I peered into it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The reflection was not just of the attic, but of another room, a room I had never seen before. It was a dark, foreboding chamber, its walls covered in the same sinister symbols that adorned the rest of the house. I tried to understand what I was seeing, but the vision in the mirror shifted and distorted, making it difficult to grasp. Then, as if guided by an unseen hand, the mirror revealed a figure, a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his face obscured by shadows. He was performing a ritual, his movements deliberate and precise. The scene changed, and I saw the same man in what appeared to be a more modern setting. The house was different, but the symbols and the ritual remained the same. It was clear that this house had a long history of dark practices, spanning across different eras and locations. The man in the mirror seemed to turn toward me, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. He reached out, and I felt a cold, sinister presence fill the room. The vision was so intense that I had to turn away, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping from the walls grew louder, almost frantic. I could feel the house's presence growing more aggressive, its malevolence manifesting in a tangible way. The mirror seemed to be a portal, a window into the house's dark past and its twisted rituals. I had to act quickly. The house was closing in. and its dark influence was becoming overwhelming. I grabbed the journal and the ceremonial dagger, hoping that the answers I needed might be contained within the mirror's revelations. I set up a makeshift altar in the attic, placing the journal, the dagger, and other ritual items in their proper places. I had to perform another ritual, one that might help me understand the mirror's vision and reveal a way to break free from the house's grasp. As I began the ritual, the house's atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with an oppressive energy. The whispers returned, more urgent and chaotic, their voices merging into a dissonant chorus. I focused on the mirror, trying to interpret its cryptic messages. Suddenly, the house shook violently. The mirror's surface cracked, and the vision it projected became a swirling vortex of darkness. The tapping from the walls turned into a deafening roar, and the house seemed to be on the brink of collapse. I completed the ritual, hoping that it would provide some answers. The mirror's glow intensified, and the dark figure reappeared, its eyes now burning with a fierce, malevolent light. It reached out, and I felt a searing pain as if the house was trying to pull me into its dark realm. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed the ceremonial dagger and plunged it into the mirror's surface. The mirror shattered, its pieces falling to the floor. The house fell silent once more, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. The vision in the mirror was gone, but the sense of foreboding remained. The house had not been defeated. It was merely biding its time, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. The true nature of the house's malevolent force remained elusive, but I knew one thing for certain. The battle was far from over. With the mirror destroyed and the ritual complete, I hoped that we had taken a step closer to breaking the cycle. But as the house continued to loom around us, its dark presence ever watchful, I knew that our struggle was far from finished. The house seemed to settle into an uneasy silence after the destruction of the mirror. It felt as though the air had been drained from the room, leaving behind a heavy, expectant stillness. We were exhausted and on edge, but there was no rest to be had. Emily remained unconscious, her condition unchanged despite my desperate efforts. Sarah and the kids were visibly distressed, their fear mounting with each passing hour. The house seemed to be playing a cruel game, its sinister presence ever present. That night, as the clock struck midnight, the house once again fell into chaos. The walls groaned and shifted, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. The growling from earlier nights had returned, more intense and menacing than ever. I gathered Sarah and the kids in the living room, trying to keep them calm. We had no idea what the house had in store for us, but I was determined to confront whatever force was behind the relentless torment. Suddenly, the house began to change. The familiar rooms twisted and warped, their dimensions stretching and contracting in impossible ways. It felt as though we were being pulled through a nightmarish labyrinth, the house itself conspiring to disorient and trap us. In the midst of the chaos, a door appeared, one that had never been there before. It was old and decrepit, its wood splintered and worn. It seemed to beckon us, and I felt a compulsion to open it. I hesitated for a moment, but the sense of urgency was overwhelming. I knew that we had to confront whatever lay behind that door if we had any hope of breaking free. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. Beyond the door lay a chamber unlike any we had seen before. It was a large circular room, its walls adorned with more of the sinister symbols that had haunted us. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it lay a dark, ancient tome. The atmosphere in the chamber was thick with malevolence, and I could feel the presence of the house's dark force pressing in from all sides. The tome seemed to pulse with an eerie light, its pages beckoning me to uncover its secrets. I approached the pedestal, my heart pounding in my chest. As I opened the tome, I was met with a series of detailed illustrations and instructions for a ritual of immense power. The ritual was designed to bind the malevolent force to the house, trapping it within its walls forever. The instructions were complex and required several specific items that I knew we did not have. The realization hit me. The house was setting us up for a final, desperate confrontation. It wanted us to fail, to succumb to its dark influence. I began to gather the items needed for the ritual, searching the chamber for anything that might help. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and the house seemed to close in around us. The walls trembled, and the air was filled with an oppressive heat. As I prepared the ritual, the house's malevolent force became increasingly aggressive. Shadows darted across the walls, and I could feel an icy chill creeping up my spine. The growling was now a roar, a deafening cacophony that threatened to overwhelm me. The final part of the ritual required a sacrifice, a willing offering to bind the dark force. The house seemed to be testing our resolve, trying to break us down. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging me to give in to the house's demands. In a moment of clarity, I realized that the house was trying to manipulate me, to make me sacrifice one of my own. The thought was horrifying, but I knew I had to resist. The dark force wanted us to turn on each other, to give in to our worst fears. I completed the ritual, performing the incantation with all the strength I could muster. The air crackled with energy, and the house seemed to convulse, its walls shaking violently. The malevolent presence grew more intense, its power pressing down on us with a crushing weight. Just as I finished the final incantation, the room was plunged into darkness. The growling ceased abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, but I knew it was only temporary. The house was still watching, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. Emily remained unconscious, and Sarah and the kids were huddled together, their fear palpable. The house had not been defeated. It had merely been subdued, its dark force momentarily contained. The battle was far from over, and we had to remain vigilant. As the house settled into its eerie calm, I knew that our fight was not yet won. The true nature of the malevolent force remained elusive, and the house was still very much alive. We had taken a step towards breaking free, but the ultimate confrontation was still to come. The house's temporary calm was unsettling. We remained on edge, the eerie silence a stark contrast to the chaos we had experienced. Emily still lay unconscious, her condition unchanged despite my desperate attempts to help her. Sarah and the kids were visibly shaken, their fear a constant reminder of our dire situation. As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was gearing up for one final, catastrophic event. We had performed the ritual, but the malevolent force had not been vanquished. It was merely waiting for the right moment to strike. Around midnight, the house began to change again. The walls creaked and groaned, and a low, menacing hum filled the air. It was as though the house was coming alive, its malevolence simmering beneath the surface. I decided to search for any remaining clues or escape routes. With the house shifting and warping around us, finding a way out seemed almost impossible. The corridors twisted and turned, their dimensions constantly changing. Every door led to another, more confusing passage, and every room seemed to merge into the next. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadowy figure moving down the hallway. It was a familiar shape, the same dark presence we had encountered before. It seemed to be watching us, its malevolent gaze following our every move. I tried to follow the figure, hoping it might lead us to an escape. The house seemed to be fighting back, its malevolent force growing more intense with each step. The walls trembled, and the floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. The figure led me to a hidden door, one I had not seen before. It was old and weathered, its surface covered in dark, intricate symbols. I hesitated for a moment, but the figure's presence was compelling. I felt a strange pull, as if the house was guiding me towards this door. I opened it and found a narrow, winding staircase leading down into the darkness. The air was cold and damp, and an unsettling silence hung over the staircase. I descended cautiously, the steps creaking ominously beneath my weight. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was an old, rusted door, its surface etched with the same symbols as the hidden door. I approached it, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The door creaked open, revealing a long, narrow tunnel. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly. I felt a strange sense of urgency, as though time was running out. I turned back to check on Sarah and the kids. They were still huddled together, their fear palpable. I knew I had to act quickly. I gathered them and led them towards the tunnel, hoping it would provide a way out. As we moved through the tunnel, the house's malevolent presence seemed to press in from all sides. The growling and whispering grew louder, more insistent. It felt as though the house was trying to drag us back, to keep us trapped within its walls. The tunnel twisted and turned, its path growing increasingly treacherous. We stumbled over debris and navigated around sharp, jagged rocks. The sense of foreboding grew stronger with each step, and I could feel the house's dark influence growing more aggressive. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a large chamber. In the center of the chamber was an old, rusted gate. It was adorned with more of the sinister symbols, and the air around it was thick with a palpable sense of dread. I approached the gate cautiously, my heart racing. The gate seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its surface shimmering with a faint, eerie light. I knew this was it, the final barrier between us and freedom. I took a deep breath and pushed the gate open. The chamber beyond was bathed in a strange, otherworldly light. It was a surreal, almost dreamlike landscape, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the house. As we stepped through the gate, I felt a sudden rush of relief. The air was fresh and clean, and the oppressive weight of the house seemed to lift. We had escaped, at least for the moment. But as we looked back, the gate began to close, the chamber fading into darkness. The house was still there, its dark presence looming in the distance. The escape had been only temporary, a brief reprieve from the terror that awaited us. We emerged into a clearing, the night air cool and crisp. We were outside the house, but the sense of dread remained. The house was still there, its dark silhouette a constant reminder of the nightmare we had endured. We had escaped the house, but the malevolent force was still out there waiting. The house had not been defeated, it was merely biding its time, ready to ensnare its next victims. As we made our way away from the house, I knew that the true horror was far from over. The house had left its mark on us, and its dark influence would never truly fade. We had survived, but the nightmare would continue to haunt us, a reminder of the terror we had faced and the darkness that still lurked beyond. We stumbled away from the house, the sense of relief mingled with the crushing weight of exhaustion. The night was eerily quiet, the oppressive atmosphere of the house giving way to an almost serene stillness. We were free, but the horror of what we had endured lingered like a dark shadow. As we walked through the cool night air, the reality of our escape began to sink in. Emily was still unconscious, and I could see the worry etched on Sarah's face. The kids clung to each other, their eyes wide with the trauma of our ordeal. We had left the house, but its malevolent presence had not left us. We reached the edge of the forest, where the moonlight illuminated the path ahead. The house loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette a constant reminder of the nightmare we had just escaped. It seemed almost alive, as if it were watching us, waiting for its chance to reclaim its prey. We decided to find shelter and call for help. The nearest town was several miles away, but we had no choice. With Emily still unconscious, we made our way to the nearest roadside, hoping for a passing car or some form of assistance. Hours passed, and the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. The cold was biting, and the exhaustion was nearly overwhelming. Sarah and the kids huddled together for warmth, their fear and fatigue evident. I tried to stay focused, but my mind was clouded with the terror we had experienced. Just before dawn, a car finally appeared. We flagged it down, and the driver, an elderly man with a kind face, stopped to help us. He took us to the nearest hospital where Emily was finally given the medical attention she desperately needed. In the sterile brightness of the hospital, I tried to piece together the events of the past few days. The house had been a living nightmare, a place of unspeakable horror and malevolence. We had escaped, but the scars of our experience would remain with us forever. Emily eventually regained consciousness, but she was disoriented and terrified. The doctors assured us that she would recover physically, but the psychological trauma was another matter. The house had taken its toll on all of us, leaving us haunted by its dark presence. We tried to explain our story to the authorities, but they found it hard to believe. The house, it seemed, was a mystery that defied explanation. There were no records of the disappearances or the dark rituals we had uncovered. It was as if the house existed outside the realm of reality, a twisted anomaly that defied understanding. As we settled into a temporary home and began the long process of healing, the house on Elm Street remained a dark memory, a symbol of the terror we had endured. We tried to move on, to rebuild our lives, but the shadow of the house lingered, a constant reminder of the darkness that had once consumed us. We knew that the house had not been vanquished. It was still out there, waiting for its next victims. The malevolent force that had haunted us would continue to seek out those who dared to enter its domain. The house was a living nightmare, a place of unspeakable horror that defied explanation. In the quiet moments of the night, when the darkness seemed to close in, we would sometimes hear the faint echoes of the growling and whispers that had tormented us. The house had left its mark on us, and its dark influence would never truly fade. We had survived, but the nightmare would continue to haunt us. The house on Elm Street was a reminder of the terror that lurked just beyond the edge of reality, a place where nightmares came to life, and the darkness was never truly defeated. As we looked to the future, we knew that we would never be free of the house's dark legacy. It would remain with us, a constant reminder of the horror we had faced and the darkness that still awaited those who dared to enter its cursed domain.